we can call this meeting to order. It is 9:03 a.m., at least sort of. And may we please have introductions, beginning with the commissioner on my right.
Mary Shoecraft.
I am Vivian Salaga, Chair.
Ralph Moon.
And Patricia Ortiz.
Thank you very much. Do we need actually to have this swearing in? Do you have to swear in the staff?
Yeah, we're going to swear in the staff.
Okay.
Solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you provide today is the truth.
I do.
Well, Dennis, do we have any announcements this morning?
Just one brief announcement, Commissioners. Good morning, Dennis Fernandez, Architecture Review and Historic Preservation Manager. Just wanted to let you know that the staff is relocating buildings from our current location at 1400 North Boulevard to another city property at 4900 West Lemon Street. So we do have information going up on our website for anyone in the public that needs to actually come in and visit us. They can look at our website at tampagov.net under Architecture Review and Historic Preservation and see the directions to our new building, or our new location. The building itself is not new. We will continue to maintain our regular phone numbers and email addresses, so none of that will be changing. And our first active day in the new building would be March the 19th.
Ooh, that's soon.
A week from today. And that concludes my announcements for this morning.
All right. I trust everyone has had an opportunity to review the minutes that were forwarded via email last week. Are there any comments or remarks regarding those minutes? May we then have
Motion to accept.
accept? Thank you. Second?
Second.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is the motion to recommend the fence standards that have been the subject of discussion over the last several months. We believe that our commissioners are pretty well versed in what has transpired, both pro and con, in the argument regarding the modification of the standards. Do any of you feel you need to be rebriefed on any of that information? At least in a short way.
Yeah, I think we'd at least like Dennis to go ahead and provide a summary, although the minutes did have a very good representation of some of the discussion from the last meeting.
Morning, Commissioners. I'll go ahead and provide a verbal summary, and then if you desire more information, we can move into that. As you are aware, we entered into a formal review of this particular item for the Tampa Heights Local Historic District Design Standards related to the section on fences and walls quite a while back. In December of 2018, the staff did, in accordance with the code for how you go about amending existing design standards, did go ahead and notice the Tampa Heights Historic District by mail, and we sent out about 600 letters out to the residents there and to all participating organizations, essentially informing them that there was going to be a meeting on January the 15th at this board to give public comment for the particular issue that we're dealing with the fence height and placement on corners. Following that public comment, the issue was scheduled on the Architecture Review Commission's agenda in accordance with the code. The process does require that the pertinent review board provide a comment to the Historic Preservation Commission as to their insight on any particular changes. And we did take that to the Architecture Review Commission on March the 6th. We reviewed that same presentation that we've gone over a few times with this particular board, and there was a representative from the Tampa Heights Civic Association in attendance of that particular meeting. And at the conclusion of the meeting discussion, the ARC motion to recommend to the HPC the design guidelines regarding fences in the Tampa Heights Historic District remain the same, accordingly remain unchanged. So we're bringing that information back to you. That was a unanimous vote, 5-0 on that particular item. So today your charge is to make a formal recommendation to Tampa City Council. We have a item scheduled with them on March the 21st, a week from Thursday, which I'll bring that motion to them, and then they will make this decision as to if the design guidelines are going to remain the same or if they wish to modify them, essentially on their own. So I know that Rachel, has prepared a sample motion for you, so it might be good for her to go ahead and review that at this time.
Sure. As you know, your motions to City Council are your opportunity to speak directly to them. So to support you in that effort, I'm providing you with sample motions. The
Excellent.
sample motions provide you with multiple options. So whoever makes the motion makes the decision. There's the underlined italics language, which allows you to put in your reasons for that, so that you can convey directly to City Council those reasons. And then when Dennis reads that motion, that's your opportunity again to speak directly to City Council.
Excellent. I understand that it's very important for this motion that as it's being crafted, that the language be very specific relative to substantial and supportive data relative to either option that is being put forward for the motion. However, based on our previous conversations at this commission level and our previous recommendation to the City Council, that this motion would indeed again be a motion to recommend that no changes be made.
I think that that it's, if you don't have any more questions for Dennis and staff, certainly making a motion to the effect that is your pleasure would be appropriate at this time. I've provided you again with multiple options.
So
Yeah.
must the motion be made exactly as worded here?
Except for
You,
this.
you
Right.
don't have to, obviously, I'm not going to hold you directly to it. The idea is to give you a background that provides the most comment. Like, we wanted to make sure that City Council knew that it was noticed correctly. I mean, Dennis will obviously make that statement too.
Right.
But it just gives you an opportunity to provide that information. You don't have to read it word for word. I won't take offense. It's provided as a guide. It certainly, just hits the things that Dennis spoke about. We had a public meeting, you took comments from them, you took comments from the Architectural Review Committee, and this, and this is your recommendation, either to uphold with no changes or to make the recommendation that the guidelines be changed.
And do we need to actually specifically state any references, quoting any references from the guidelines at all, or no? Because that's public information.
I mean, if there's, the italicized and underlined portion is again an opportunity for you to provide the rationales for the motion that you make, to either uphold or to either recommend that there are no changes made or to recommend that there be changes made. So if there was something in the design guidelines or something in the code or something that was said specifically at the meetings, the tenor of the information that you heard, things like that could be just a basis and a background and help City Council understand why it was that you made the motion that you did.
All right, are there any questions or further comments from any of the commissioners that you'd like clarified before we proceed to the motion?
I just had a question about the reasoning. I realize it's important that as we make this motion, it's in an attempt to communicate to city council specifically why we don't want to change it. So what should we reference in the motion specifically to help them recognize the efforts to solicit comment from the public and from the Architectural Review Commission to make sure it's consistent and comprehensive? Is that necessary? Or it could be a simple statement?
I mean, it can be a simple statement. Again, this is just a tool for you to use. The idea is that, that you can communicate what some of those things were. You know, if it's, we heard from so many people, that could be a reason. You don't necessarily have to get into detail about numbers or things like that, but just an opportunity for you to explain the rationale. When you're quasi-judicial, you know, it's to explain to the court. It's background. It helps them understand what you were thinking. So this is your opportunity to help city council understand what you're thinking.
And how many members of the public were here to support not changing it? Was there 20 to 20 or?
Well, on page 2 of the minutes, there's a list of, I believe, 9 individuals there, and I would say at least 8 of the individuals were in support, but you also had the neighborhood association that was representing the neighborhood, speaks for the neighborhood. So, you know, they were generally talking about their membership and representing the neighborhood.
And as I understand it, the neighborhood association did have a meeting specifically to address the issues relative to the fence standards at a neighborhood association meeting, at which typically there are anywhere from 40 to 50 persons in attendance. I did not attend that last neighborhood meeting for reasons we all can understand why. So I couldn't speak specifically to how many people were there, but knowing the history of their group, that's generally how many would be there.
I would say one reoccurring theme, because the staff has been engaging kind of informally and formally with the neighborhood for quite a while on this particular issue, but one particular theme that kept sort of reemerging from discussion is that the residents essentially feel that this particular element of design review preserves the historic character of their neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And although not necessarily the same as what general city code is, that they have a unique setting to the neighborhood, and that in and of itself is preserved by the application of this particular section of the design standards.
Yes, and I don't know if I just did a little language stuff here, just because I feel we obviously have to put something in there.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to test this with the board.
Sure.
Sure.
So we go through, no changes made, and it says based on comments, this is not a
Okay.
motion.
Oh, okay.
I'm just testing it. with-
Sorry.
Floating the
I thought you
balloon.
were making a motion.
No. Based on comments received and facts presented at numerous public hearings, the Tampa Heights Design Guidelines fencing standards preserve and support the unique significance of the Tampa Heights Historic District. Now, that might not be specific enough, but at least it's the whole point of the guidelines is to protect the significance of that particular historic district, and I think we believe that
Right.
the fencing standards as they stand do that, which is why we don't want to change them.
Correct.
Exactly.
If I may, I had something which I think is maybe a little more simple, we could
Sure.
perhaps
Go-
blend
oh,
together.
please.
I came up with, based on outstanding neighborhood support, where it was indicated that this particular design feature contributed to the unique character of the Tampa Heights neighborhood.
Much nicer.
Let me try my I have a motion to maintain the existing Tampa Heights design guidelines following comments from 9 individuals and a representative of the neighborhood who expressed interest in preserving the historic character of the neighborhood.
I'm not so sure you should mention the 9 individuals, because that doesn't sound like very many.
Okay,
I think as long as we can say that there were multiple public hearings and community meetings, I think it's important maybe to stress the fact that there were multiple community meetings to discuss this particular issue. Because engaging the community is a critical component of city council's thinking when they're considering issues. So,
And I guess the only thing I would add, and this is not part of the motion, this is really more of an editorial comment, is that in my opinion, this feels like a code enforcement issue. There have been violations in the neighborhood, and at the moment, I don't know what the current status is. You know, once they're in violation, there's a whole process as to what needs to happen with
Right.
that fencing, and so there's disagreement in the neighborhood, obviously, about these standards. However, they are what they are, and if we're supporting them, then really the next logical step is to come in and start dealing with the ones that are in clear
Yeah.
violation.
wasn't
And
there
Or-
only
or
one
to-
dissenting voice, though?
That, correct.
Just one.
But there were photographs shown of other items
I
that
see.
perhaps were not done in compliance with the current standards. We know of one specifically, so that's just more of an editorial comment.
And just, yeah, and I think that as I'm looking at this process, that's sort of, on the side of what your charge is here for today, but just, addressing that, the staff has worked with the neighborhood association as well to identify those properties within the district which they believed, were out of compliance. And we've done research and have begun code enforcement action on those properties, which we can essentially, demonstrate, have done it without have made modifications to those areas without a certificate of appropriateness. So we're working on that, sort of on an ancillary track with code enforcement as well. And at the same time, we're kind of dealing with this. And obviously, at some point, they may sort of merge again, but, where we're at, they're sort of on different tracks.
Great, thank you so much.
It would vastly assist the neighborhoods and the neighborhood associations, and this is another editorial comment, if a permit were required for fences. And that way you trigger automatically the fact that they are in historic districts, just like you would have for anything else that one would have to do. You need to get a permit to change your roof. And, but for some reason fences have, maybe because fences are considered a part of landscaping and it's not really under the purview of permitting processes, but it would assist in future issues of this nature if that were the case. So are we prepared to have someone take an initial go around here for a motion?
I'll take a swing at it. Okay, so I'd like to make a motion that after receiving public comments at public hearings held on January 15th, 2019, advance notice of which was sent as required by City of Tampa Code Section 27-264 Part B to all property owners within the Tampa Heights Historic District, and after today receiving Architectural Review Commission comments, I move that we recommend to the City Council that the existing fence standards of the Tampa Heights Design Guidelines be upheld and no changes made based on the outstanding support from the Tampa Heights community, staff of the Historic Preservation Division. I kind of jumbled that up. Can I start again, or maybe could I just start with state my reasons?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so based on outstanding support from the Tampa Heights community and staff of the Historic Preservation Division, who indicated this particular feature contributes to the unique character of the Tampa Heights neighborhood. And
Is
from there,
that
I will.
sufficient,
I think that's your reason. That's
right?
Okay.
Do we need any additional
Reasons?
reasons?
Well, I mean, it's certainly legally sufficient as you
Okay.
did it. It's your pleasure as to, you know, what you communicate in your motion. It's legally sufficient, as you said.
Would it be appropriate to also add here that we may like a permit for a fence, or is that
No.
something we would
No,
come
I
up
don't
with
think,
another?
I think
okay.
this is just supposed to be the recommendation on the fence.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, is there a second to that motion?
Second that motion.
All those in favor signify by aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, and as I said, staff will be bringing that motion to city council on the 21st, a week from Thursday.
On the 21st, okay.
Am I just advancing through the keyboard? Okay, I'm just gonna just momentarily work on getting your presentation up on the monitors. Just a moment, please. So I'll begin kind of introducing this in the meantime. So item number 7 is dealing with the Ybor City Local Historic District. I think at this point, after this discussion with fences and walls, you have a clear understanding that the Historic Preservation Commission has a very important role in creating new district guidelines and also amending district guidelines. We've a long-standing objective of this board has been to update the design guidelines that we have in place. Really, as a whole, all the district design guidelines are in need of updating, both just because the nature of the historic districts has continued to evolve, and there's always changes in materiality and different approaches when you're dealing with both rehabilitation and new construction. It was identified early on that the Ybor City District was the district that was in the most need for design standards update because they were the oldest and there was essentially the most activity as far as intense construction going on there. So staff had begun this process a while back, several years ago, but we were never able to really assemble the time to be able to really appropriately dedicate to it because it's a pretty large undertaking to really analyze the entire district and then create design standards and go through the public process. But with the availability of some funding that we were able to obtain, we now are able to kind of resurrect this issue again. I don't want to use that term, but to reinvigorate it and bring it back to you. And so I wanted to to kick it off, I wanted to give you an overview of the existing situation and then an idea of the process, which would be a little bit different than the process that we had for the fences and walls, but we'll still be under the same code section. So Ybor City Local Historic District obviously is a very important historic district in the city of Tampa. It's our essentially Latin Quarter dealing with a relationship of the cigar manufacturing industry and that's its effect on the development of the city of Tampa. And then obviously there was a number of extraordinary architectural buildings that were originally designated by the state legislature and then subsequently assumed by the city's preservation ordinances. The period of significance of Ybor City, historic significance, is 1886 to 1940. Within that period, there are about 1,400 structures that are considered to be contributing structures and about 639, 640 non-contributing. That number's sort of always changing. But you see the history of Ybor City. It's been since even prior to formal preservation regulations, there's been a desire to preserve that unique character of Ybor City. And having done that, a lot of the efforts were done at grassroots levels, which the establishment of the Barrio Latino Commission, really predating all the preservation ordinances, as a grassroots group that was with the goal of trying to identify significant portions of Ybor City and to preserve those. The most recent change to the district was in 2013 when, through the activities of this commission, we expanded the district boundaries, the local district boundaries to the northwest, encapsulating section of the VM Ybor district. So almost entirely the local historic district now encompasses the National Historic Landmark District. We still have a segment we haven't been able to actually include, but we will be taking another run at that, I think, in coordination with this effort. The existing guidelines were created in 1986, and there were some subsequent revisions, the most current of which was in 2003 when a section dealing with the industrial sector was added as an expansion took the district to the south. The Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties essentially gives a broad parameters for how you would deal with historic districts and historic buildings, historic sites. And within this particular area of the city, we're talking about what would have been, commonly referred to sort of as a manufacturing town that began with strong indicators of immigrant participation by the population of cigar industry workers that came here from different countries. The advisory guidelines at the local level usually provide general design and technical recommendations. However, they do tend to coordinate with the larger standards as a whole. And the National Park Service provides briefs and bulletins periodically to assist with interpretation of the application of the Secretary of the Interior standards. Staff relies on those quite a bit in the architecture review process with both the Barrio Latino Commission and the Architecture Review Commission. And the reason that I add this in here is that really any set of design guidelines that locally that we create should coordinate with the principles of the federal standards. So reasons for updating design guidelines, essentially as they pertain to Ybor City Local Historic District, is that the categories tend to be very broad within the existing guidelines. I think when they were written, there was a tendency to focus on rehabilitation of historic structures and not really to anticipate what new type of new construction might be coming in. If you look at the period of when they were created, there wasn't a large number of new construction projects within that area. The current guidelines do reinforce the Secretary of the Interior standards through references, but we feel that it could be more effective, particularly for those properties that are engaging in rehabilitation and seeking federal tax credit incentives. As I said, the new construction section needs to be further delineated both at the residential, commercial, and the industrial sector. There should be additional details dealing with additions to structures, relocations, and demolition sections. Some of these sections are essentially underrepresented in the current design guidelines. As I said, new materials come into play, new technologies, new approaches on how you handle rehabilitation are always sort of in play and being discussed. So I think, in defining exactly where, particularly with rehabilitations, the district should land is something that's going to be sort of vetted out through this process by both public comment and discussion with the commission. And then just a sort of, kind of an overused term, but, being user-friendly, having the users of this particular resource be able to get the information that they need in a clear and concise manner, and then, moving them on through the process in the most expedient manner is always a goal. So there's a number of these, what design standards can do and can't do, and I won't go through all of them, but essentially, we're going to work to try to obtain the most complete and effective set of design standards that we can, because as you can see, we don't get the opportunity to update them very often. We did want to, in the laying out of these design standards, as you'll see in a moment, sort of break them down into smaller sections so that when we need to perhaps go back and update a section, we don't have to, essentially redo the entire set of standards to accomplish that. So in our thought process, there would be, and these are just essentially drafts of concepts, but to provide an overview would be sort of the first goal for essentially the user that may not have that much information about Ybor City, about why it's important to preserve this area and what makes it unique. So we'd want to have an introduction and just a brief history of the area. The historic district designations would be referenced and explained as far as what the different designations in the district are. We would talk about the economic impacts of historic preservation, and particularly that of heritage tourism within the Ybor City Historic District as an example of why preservation makes economic sense. Discuss some of the incentives that are in place that would be available to individuals that engage in work within the Ybor City Historic District. The purpose of the design guidelines and the appropriate way to apply the design standards, I think, would be used. The role of architectural review with the Barrio Latino Commission would be discussed. And then some general process and procedures. Those are of course delineated further within the ordinance, so we'll cross-reference those areas of the ordinance. But obviously the process of architecture review is important for the user of these particular standards to understand. We'll list out the Secretary of the Interior standards, sort of a glossary of architectural styles of the district. I think is always something that's sort of expected within design standards, that you're defining what the character defining features of a particular style are. And then the prevalent architectural styles that existed during the period of historic significance. It's not necessarily going to be the final version, but we feel that that encompasses a lot of the issues that we hear from a daily basis that people are asking the staff. And then once again, we'll ensure that the guidelines are rich with photographs and illustrations and drawings to assist the user in understanding the points that are being made. Of course, the rehabilitation section is probably the most common section as far as approaches that is within any set of design guidelines that are used throughout the country. And those are particularly based on the Secretary of the Interior standards as sort of the fundamental principles. So we'll want to provide an overview of the standards and then deal with the different components of essentially the predominant levels of rehabilitation that we see within the district, which become further clear as you experience the district and understand it has a heavy commercial component. So there will be obviously some sections that are dedicated towards commercial rehabilitation. Storefronts were one of the first things to be modified and lost over time. So how you properly rehabilitate storefronts, not just historically, but in accordance with contemporary codes, because contemporary codes often don't allow you to recreate exactly what was there. So you have to try to achieve a look and a feel by at the same time while complying with the building code standards. Doors and entries, obviously part of the commercial storefront system. Windows, screens, which comes up quite a bit with residential type projects. Porches and porticocheres, which are obviously character defining features throughout this period of significance. Roofs, dormers, and parapets. Shutters and awnings, exterior surfaces and materials, so that deals with anything from wood siding to brick to stone. The architectural detailing and ornamentation, obviously there's going to be an emphasis on that in rehabilitation, particularly when you have elements that have changed over time and you're trying to achieve an accurate picture of what was the original structure, or at least a version of that structure during the period of historic significance. You want to deal with trying to identify what the particulars of ornamentation and detailing are without adding, embellishing those to a point which would be in contradiction to what the Secretary of the Interior standards recommends. And then other more sort of nuts and bolts items like foundations and closures. Obviously, there's a lot within that, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion on how to properly encompass that particular section. You know, once again, I think images, those images particularly that are from Ybor City are important into kind of getting our points across with a lot of these things. So luckily we've done a lot of, particularly the drawings, the illustrations. We've had some talented individuals work on those, so we still have a lot of that remaining that we'll share with our consultant, as well as going out and taking sort of real-world pictures, both of the, you know, the good and the bad, to be able to convey the points that we're trying to make. And then the section on new construction. This is the section that usually is the most controversial when you're dealing with design standards. So the ordinances themselves don't allow for the architecture review commissions to dictate style. But traditionally in Ybor City, it's been a somewhat conservative approach on new construction. There's been a sort of a tendency from the review boards to feel that new construction, which may not really properly represent the traditions of Ybor City, somehow may detract from the original structures. So it's new construction tends to be, particularly large scale new construction, of the commercial type, tends to be heavily deliberated, and often individuals of the public participate in that and get very passionate about that. So understanding, you know, the role the new construction plays within the historic district, the types of new construction, you know, both at the commercial areas, the residential areas, and then where they somewhat blend, because Ybor City is a blending of different building types within a particular neighborhood. Just the concept of the cigar factory as an industrial building, which was historically the nucleus of the neighborhood, and then casitas, because cigar worker houses were essentially constructed within walking distance of that. And then you have small scale commercial structures that were the neighborhood bodegas that provided, you know, like a grocery type store, convenience type store would be today, that provided access to the necessary, you know, living materials that you have as far as a day-to-day basis, food and supplies. So that trying to achieve a construction within the confines of the YC zoning district obviously is going to be something that's going to be emphasized. And the YC zoning was, I think, had a lot of foresight when it was created, and understanding that there needed to be zoning classifications within this area that promoted the ability to retain these mixture of uses that may otherwise in a more contemporary neighborhood not be allowed. Dealing with accessory structures were much more common in our residential historic districts, such as Tampa Heights, Seminole Heights, and Hyde Park. But just the layout and the way that Ybor City functioned from day to day meant that there wasn't a lot of accessory structures. The parcels themselves tend to be smaller, more narrow, which obviously leads to some challenges. But nowadays, as we're seeing structures being adaptively reused or new construction being entered into the district, we're seeing the need to provide off-street auto storage, and then obviously other storage for some of the structures that are smaller and may need some ancillary storage and not able to accommodate within the primary structure. Dealing with additions, of course, is always a major issue within the design guidelines at all levels. Representing architectural traditions with all the different building components, but one that comes to mind along 7th Avenue are the roof forms. You see that you know, repeating element of parapet roof structures along 7th Avenue. So sort of defining that and encouraging that within new construction, I think, is important. Detailing and material choices. Does every building have to be brick, or is there room for other materials that complement the historic structures? Doors, entries, and windows, once again, ensuring that those meet the traditions of the district. Facade alignment and rhythm, these are terms that are sort of being extracted from the ordinance, which defines appropriate new construction. Placement, orientation, and spacing, scale, proportion, and massing. Accommodating the industrial sector. We still have industrial zoning classifications that are out there, and ensuring that those uses can continue to be a part of Ybor City now, and then if they decide to enter into the area. And then miscellaneous infill construction. We see just a lot of different things that were never really accommodated within the original guidelines that we need to anticipate and try to accommodate so that this stays a relevant document for years to come. And once again, some of the visuals that we can rely upon and point to. The one thing with Ybor City is there's a lot of references. We've had successes, and we've had challenges, and we've had some areas where we've fallen short in the design review process. So I think they're all opportunities to learn and to move forward with hopefully that as information that we can consider as we evaluate new projects. Then there's a lot of, within Ybor City particularly, there's a lot of just related design elements and site elements that are continuously being dealt with, somewhat like fences and walls. But, we say appurtenant fixtures, and these are the things that sort of get added on to buildings when you have the need to have antennas or lighting or, mailboxes and these things that, kind of creep up that may not be accommodated, but if they're done inappropriately can really distract from the historic nature of an area. Code compliance, ensuring that the different attributes within the area are code compliant. An example might be a certain type of signage that may not necessarily be allowed within the zoning code. Color palette, Ybor City is the only historic district that the board actually has review over color.
And
So-
that's too bad.
So color is something particularly, I think, that gets challenged, particularly in the commercial area. Historically, in the clubs and the bars, always use color as sort of an extension of signage to draw attention. So,
But it would be nice if the other districts had that as well, I think.
color's challenging. It's one of the more challenging things that probably the staff deals with. And we've had different evolutions of the color palette, but I think defining a color palette for the different types of uses there and something that's achievable. One thing I'll say is we don't endorse a particular brand, but it's more of a tone and hue. So if someone, particularly was brand loyal, we could accommodate that even today with how we approach color. Fences and walls, there's a different nuance to, I think, walls in the historic district and Ybor City Historic District. There was a lot of knee walls, and historically around the cigar factories, they were walled and somewhat usually with some sort of wrought iron ornamentation to enhance the site. So, when we recreate those, we spend a lot of time referencing historic pictures and references to ensure that that's done in accordance with the style of the period of historic significance. I think disaster preparedness as a whole, particularly with storms, has become very relevant within all the historic districts. The need to ensure that historic structures are properly secured in the event of an emergency, and dealing with that in a way that doesn't detract from the historic character of the structure all the other times when an emergency isn't upon us. Landscaping and site elements, that would pertain to 3-family and above structures and commercial structures, to ensure that the landscaping is consistent with the historic traditions, which was somewhat sparse within the historic district. In this particular historic district, it wasn't a lavish district, and it was usually generally most of what was planted in Ybor City was something that you could generally eat. But, we've gotten away from that a little bit, but ensuring that landscaping is not over embellished to detract or obscure historic buildings or new properties. Modern equipment, security lights, antennas, any sort of satellite dish, ATMs. These are things that traditionally were not. Solar collectors is another one. Traditionally not within the historic district. So trying to accommodate modern equipment in a way that's historically sensitive, and not to just have a prohibition against it, because that somewhat, I think keeps your district at a disadvantage to other areas for redevelopment. You want to try to accommodate it, but just to do that in a way that doesn't detract from the historic character of the area. Signage is probably in this particular district one of the most character-defining features. It's become challenging, I'll say, to accommodate projecting signs into the right-of-way, but we still work with property owners to do so. As you are aware, in the past, we were able to modify the existing sign code in the city ordinances to allow for the recreation of historic signs that otherwise wouldn't be allowed under contemporary code. So we've worked with property owners to achieve that in Ybor City. And one of the good things about Ybor City is if you look at the older pictures, there's a lot of historic references to historic signs. Almost every building had some type of significant signage, blade signs or projecting signs under the awnings or the balconies. So I think that's part of the experience when you're at Ybor City, and trying to balance that with sort of scale and context and rhythm is always something the staff is engaged in. Of course, parking, can't have a conversation about any of the areas without dealing with parking. So dealing with both structured parking and surface parking, I think, will be important, as well as maintaining historic references for sidewalks and paving materials as we're dealing both in rehabilitation and in new construction. And you see I think some of the references that we were pointing to throughout the presentation here as well. Then I talked earlier about the need to deal with demolitions and reconstructions, how to approach adaptive reuse of historic structures. That is taking a historic building and changing its use. For instance, a cigar factory being adaptively reused into apartments, let's say. How you approach that in a way that both is able to keep the historic structure relevant for reuse and keep its character-defining features in place. Often when you're dealing with adaptive reuse, you're dealing with bringing buildings up to codes as far as fire, life safety, and accessibility codes. So in meeting those needs in accordance with the standards is always something that's challenging and takes some good thoughtfulness on behalf of the developer and the city staff as well. Okay, that would be me. Excuse me. Not sure why that did that, but it did. And then sustainability and energy efficiency. Once again, that's something that's emerging on a daily basis. We want to be able to accommodate that within the guide of the different standards that are in place, and ensure that our recommendations aren't essentially invalidating a particular program for any of the preservation incentives that are available. And once again, some visuals to assist with that particular section, as we can imagine would be quite elaborate. So just in touching on the process that's delineated within 27-264 of the Historic Preservation Commission's code. Generally, the Historic Preservation Commission decides that the time has come to update design guidelines. I think that previous commissions have done that. I would anticipate that this commission would have a goal of that as well. Once that initiation of the revisions occurs and you're allocating staff time, our staff time to work on that. The staff begins commencement of development of a draft. Normally how I would approach that would be to develop sections at one time, and then to be bringing the sections back for review and comment to the board through routine updates. If the need comes, and there have been essentially subcommittees that can be formed from the HPC to allocate an individual or to a commissioner or two to participate with staff discussions. When we get to that point, you know, we can have a discussion on that if that's something that the commission feels is going to be valuable use of some of the members' time. And that would be just to somewhat have one of the commissioners' input on a more of a one-by-one basis with the staff as issues arise, and not you know, just scheduled at a hearing from time to time. I'll stop here just for a moment because I want to say that this is really the section that I'm dealing with right now with the commencing the development of the draft. So as I said, we've done quite a bit of work. We have a lot of photographs and images, drawings, plans that we've assembled over time that we think would be useful in the creation of a draft of the update to the Ybor City Local Historic District Guidelines. But I have to thank the Ybor City Development Corporation because they are our benefactor in providing us funding and additional funding to what our normal budget allows to be able to actually see this through this time. So they've committed to the funding necessary to retain a consultant to work with the staff on developing the guidelines, and then also going through the process of working with the public and interfacing with the public at workshops and public meetings to gather input, which becomes obviously very important in getting community buy-in to a revision. So we are working with, right now, our purchasing department on developing requests for qualifications that we'll advertise in the near future. And once we do that, there'll be hopefully a selection of qualified individuals that we'll be able to choose from to begin the revision process. Of course, we're engaging in that right now, so when that's completed and advertised, I'll certainly let the commission know. Once we've obtained the consultant, we're going to begin a process of reaching out to the public. The code requires that there's a single public meeting that occurs in the same way that we advertise for fences and walls for the Tampa Heights. But I've felt that there needs to be multiple meetings for this particular section or segment of the process. So we'll work with our consultant on his, opportune moments to be able to reach out to the public and then in the areas. We have different users. We have our commercial users, we have our residential users. There's individuals in the district that are just passionate about preservation that want to engage at all different levels. So to have different meetings in different areas at different times to be able to allow for a lot of public input. Sorry about that.
Dennis's. Oh, the song.
Okay, hopefully that'll take care of that. Additionally, we will be bringing this back, as I said, on our agendas as well at the HPC for discussion and for input from the commission. And then at a certain point when the draft is deemed as being mostly complete, we would need to have a recommendation given from the Barrio Latino Commission as to their acceptance or any changes that they would want to see. What we've done in the past is to have actually a joint workshop with the HPC and the Barrio to allow for more of an open forum of discussion when, for you to receive some of the insights of the Barrio and what some of their challenges may be when they're trying to actually apply the design guidelines. But I think that's a different process, and we have to notice a little bit differently for that, so we'll get back to you when that's appropriate. Following their formal recommendation, as is today, we'll bring a final draft back to the Historic Preservation Commission. And the commission at that time would make a recommendation to city council to, I would imagine at that point, to adopt the design guidelines. We would then forward that recommendation to the planning commission for evaluation and a recommendation, and then it would be set for 2 public hearings at city council, the second of which would be the final adoption. So as you can see, it's although the flow fits on one page, it's quite a bit of work, and that's why these things are not commonly taken up without a lot of intention. But we feel that now we have, now's the time to do this. We have the funding. We feel that with the assistance of the consultant, the staff will be able to dedicate the necessary time to ensuring that the process is productive and hopefully results in a set of design standards that we can use for a number of years ahead.
Do you have a guesstimate of the time frame yet? This will be a year process, a year and a half? Who knows?
I would say at least a year.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I mean, if we
It's a
were
lot to do.
Yeah, if we were going to begin this process, within the, let's say, I mean, we're sort of underway, but once we get the consultant, we're kind of be the kickoff of that. And there's going to be a lot of staff time with the consultant and kind of bringing them up to speed too, so that they're going to want somebody that has obviously experience in developing design guidelines, but at the same time is open-minded to understanding what our unique situations are and what our unique challenges are locally. So this, there's no action necessary today, but this I think was a worthwhile discussion. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or we can have a discussion about the processes or anything you'd like.
I just have one comment, which is oftentimes when the historic districts guidelines are prepared, the economic incentive portion can be pretty weak. And there's heritage tourism, of course, but there's also lots of information and studies that basically will show that properties within a historic district typically are valued at a higher number than properties outside of the district. There's been quite a few studies about that. I know the National Trust has information about that. And just, it's like I said, at least I'm on the user side in the sense that I often have to talk to people about why it's important that their house is in a historic district and as opposed to being outside.
Sure.
And that is one of the things that does ring a bell, particularly on the residential side. I'm not familiar with the commercial side, but that's my only comment, is to try to beef that up so it's not so milk toasty. And put some,
Right,
there's a really good reasons to be within a historic district.
Well, I think that one of the common challenges that the staff gets is, when you're dealing with a historic building and, a developer who may not be as versed in adaptive reuse, feels that it makes more economic sense to tear the building down and rebuild than it does to retain. So, educating developers and, not only the benefits, the reliefs within the building code, the reliefs within some of the other codes for redevelopment that exist, but, actually being able to, I say, bring the carrot instead of the stick to the discussion and, talk about the dollars and cents of it is very helpful. And as you said, there's national studies, there's state studies through the State Historic Preservation Office, and then there's almost a common sense approach of looking at areas of similar eras and seeing, where they're at today, ones that are historic districts and ones that are not.
I had a question about just the general theme. It's pretty exciting going through the whole list, although it looks like a heck of a lot of work.
Yeah.
But in terms of the reason that we're here today is because there was longevity in the materials that were used to construct these buildings back in the early 1900s. Brick, solid wood, pretty much, concrete, marble, and metal. And all those are fairly forgiving with regard to moisture. But some of the challenges we have just locally, just south of Tampa, dealing with housing, is precipitated by the fact that the materials are very vulnerable to moisture in a hot, humid, rainy climate.
Sure.
So I noticed you went through a number of things, including materials and so forth, but if it's possible to be thinking that in order to have a successful historic preservation and in codes, there's also has to be an underlying theme of longevity. are we incorporating materials that will be stable and forgiving to moisture and so forth, and can be rehabilitated easily? Because right now, in the residential market, there's a predominance of composite wood products, particle board, MDF, OSB in particular, and that's the most predominant material in the world right now is OSB. Not good for historic preservation. There's no component. So we should. That'll be my underlying theme as I go through some of these ideas. Is to incorporate materials that have longevity rather than those that could be expedient and low cost, but don't have a chance to go past 25 or 30 years of life expectancy before they fail.
And I'll say, for the most part, I think, our staff is very open to new materials, particularly traditional materials that are being manipulated in new ways that extend their longevity. And there's examples of different species of woods that are out there, that lumber that is more weather resistant, more resistant to humidity, and just performs better over the life of a project. At the end of the day, we do not want to be part of a project that essentially ends up with something that looks good for the first year or two, but then long term is just sort of a nightmare for that property owner to manage. So we want to try to meet our goals, but at the same time be cognizant of quality and durability. Now, I think when we're dealing with rehabilitation, that discussion is a very different discussion than new construction, because in new construction you can certainly utilize contemporary materials. You just have to have more of a traditional application of those materials. So, there's buildings that are being built right now that, one comes to mind in Ybor City that, if you're driving down 21st to 22nd Street near the Arturo Fuente factory, there's a large building that looks like a cigar factory, but actually that's a bonded cigar warehouse. It's essentially a large cooler. But, the way that they approached it, it fits in very well. It's a very contemporary, secure facility, but fits into the district very well. So that's quite an accomplishment, and I think it's a testament to not only the staff's direction, but also the willingness of the developer to approach it in that manner, and then the willing of the Barrio Latino Commission to receive that and say, well, this seems like this would be something maybe that might be useful for the future. So we're going to try to put it within our process and see what the output was, and it just was very successful. They're not always successful. We have things we learn from. We have to be careful of precedent, but when there's a plethora of new materials that are sort of on the market, you're not really sure sometimes about just what the durability of that's going to be.
And to that comment about precedent, on my years of sitting on the Architectural Review Commission, it just never fails that someone will present a project that is really inappropriate, but says, well, my neighbor across the street did this, and the guy down the road did this. And so I'm hoping that somewhere in your section on purpose and use of the guidelines, that there could be some fairly strong statements regarding inappropriate precedences that should not apply when people are looking at doing their own developments and remodelings and additions. And it grates on your nerve as a commissioner because you want to just go.
Well, it's a blank slate, and I think, we're talking about having workshops, with the Architectural Review Board, the Barrio. I think that's where you can really get that information about, not being sort of in a, in a bubble while you're trying to develop this, but, making them practical and usable.
And, while the Barrio is unique as a community, so much of what you're going to be going through would be so appropriate to begin to apply to the other historic neighborhoods when their turn comes up for design guidelines reviews. So maybe what you're doing now is a lot of homework that can be satisfactorily applied to some of the other neighborhoods as well.
Right, that's my intention.
Mm-hmm.
So
That'd
as
be
I said, we'll,
exciting.
be bringing you back periodic updates on this, but this was sort of our rollout for this morning's meeting.
I'd just like to mention that I think it's a really good idea that you stated that you'll be using a glossary or definition section, because I think that's one of the problems we run into quite often when we're reviewing a project is poor definitions or lack of definitions. I think pictures are very great too, because it can get right to the point. And also, I'm happy to hear that you're going to be paying particular attention to signage. I think that's very important in this historic district.
Yeah.
So, sounds good to me so far.
Thank you.
Any other comments, anyone? Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
This is really pretty exciting. I know that you may not want volunteers, but to assist in your process, but the Tampa Bay Foundation for Architecture and Design does have a heritage committee. And if we bring this up to them, I am sure that there are some who might be willing to provide volunteer assistance in this
Okay.
process.
We'll definitely keep that in mind. It'd be very
Yeah.
useful.
Alrighty, then, moving on our agenda, the date and time of our next regularly scheduled HPC meeting is now May 14, 2019 at 9 a.m., and we'll see you all there. Has there been any movement yet to get us another commissioner or two for our board?
Always, we're
Always
always
working on that?
searching. Of course, there's one commissioner who's absent today, but I know the city council had advertised, but I don't believe there's any applications received. So I think most likely it won't be until after the new administration is placed, if it's going to occur. I know that there's a lot of business that's sort of being summed up right now, but if there is any individual who's interested, they can certainly contact me at my office at 813-274-3100 option 3, and I'll be happy to discuss that with them and determine which seats are open that they can make application for.
Great. Is there any new business to be brought forward? Okay.
Chair Salaga, before moving for adjournment, maybe you could make a generic motion to file and receive and file any documents that were presented. We had talked about
Yes.
doing it with the generic motion.
Absolutely. May we please have a motion to receive and file documents that were submitted during the course of this public hearing?
Go ahead.
Do we need to say specifically by you?
I'd like to make a motion that we receive and file all documents received during this meeting.
Second.
All in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. And it is now maybe 11 minutes past 10. We're not really exactly sure about these clocks. They're a little different from each other, but we are adjourned at approximately 10:15.
Good job. Motion.